Good morning, everybody, again. We're continuing our series in the Bible in Matthew, and we're reading this morning from Matthew chapter 14. We're reading verses 13 to 21. When Jesus heard what had happened, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. Hearing of this, the crowds followed him on foot from the towns. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them and healed those who were ill. As evening approached, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a remote place and it's already getting late. Send the crowds away so that they can go to the villages and buy themselves some food." Jesus replied, "They do not need to go away. You give them something to eat." "We have here only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish," they answered. "Bring them here to me," he said. And he told the people to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the people. They all ate and were satisfied, and the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. The number of those who ate was about 5,000 men, besides women and children. And this is God's word for us this morning. This is a sermon in 2 sections. There's going to be a first section that we have here, then there's going to be a break. If you're watching live on Zoom, then we're going to listen to some music, and then we're going to return to the second bit. If you're looking on YouTube or you're looking on the website, they'll just run from one into another with a brief break in the middle. Milton Jones is a comedian who happens to be a Christian, and he makes some observations about the Christian faith. He says Christianity is a little bit like knitting, basically good, but appears to be responsible for a lot of bad things. Sometimes people think of church as being like a giant helicopter, he says. They don't want to get too close in case they get sucked into the rotas. Speaking about the church, he says, you don't have to be part of the team. You can go and kick a ball around on your own if you like. Just have a plan when the opposition turns up, that's all. He says salvation is a little bit like being returned to factory settings. The only thing is you've got to acknowledge that there is a factory and there could be some settings. He says about Jesus. Now, Jesus had a beard and sandals and long hair, although we don't know for sure about the beard or the sandals or the long hair. I like this, what he says. He says, to say that Christianity is just one of several religions is a bit like saying that water is just one type of many drinks. It's a bit more fundamental than that, he says. What about Christianity? What is it that you find easy to believe or hard to believe about Christianity? There's lots of elements to it, and lots of people come with their doubts and their questions, and that's good. And Jesus invites you to consider those and to consider what he has to say. And as a church, we ask you to consider that as well. I wonder if there are bits of it that you find that are hard to believe, that you're skeptical about, that you find it hard to do as Milton Jones encourages you to do, which is to see Christianity as being different to all other religions, that it's actually much more fundamental than that. Maybe when you come to a passage like the feeding of the 5,000, you particularly find that hard because it's this incredible miracle. And it's worth noting that all 4 of the gospel accounts in the Bible, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, record this miracle. In fact, it's the only miracle other than the resurrection that appears in all 4. In one sense, this is a simple story. Jesus has withdrawn to a wilderness for solitary reflection after the death of his friend John the Baptist. Jesus sees the crowds that have come, and rather than running away or going into solitude even more, he has compassion on them, we read, and then he begins to teach them. The disciples come to them, and it's getting late, and they wonder if they should send the crowds home. And Jesus says no, and he inquires about what food is there, and the disciples report that there's 5 loaves and 2 fish. And miraculously, supernaturally, completely remarkably, Jesus feeds the entire crowds. 5,000 men were told, plus women and children, and they all are satisfied, have enough to eat, and there's even some food left over. It's an extraordinary event. Now, in the second part of this talk, we'll look at the meaning behind this. But I want to use the first section to begin to introduce the idea of thinking about, well, is there evidence that we can believe the truth of this? Why should we believe the truth of this? And ask the question, are these narratives and these accounts of Jesus doing this, are they reliable? I'll introduce that in this section, and I'll give you some examples at the beginning of the second section, and then we'll think at the very end about some meaning behind what's going on here. It's worth remembering as we do this that at the heart of Christianity are truth claims that essentially are make or break ones. Well, what do I mean by that? They're kind of yes or no answers. Christianity says that Jesus Christ was God in the flesh, who's mankind's only eternal hope. Well, is that true? Christianity believes that Jesus Christ died to atone for the sins of all of those who believe in him. It's the only way, it says, that you can be forgiven and be with God eternally. Well, is that true? Christianity says that Jesus Christ rose supernaturally from the dead and is now active in the world as the Master, the Lord, the King of the entire cosmos. Well, is that true? Many people say and believe that to be a Christian means to suspend your reason, means to set your mind aside. And the reality is that the exact opposite is true. To be able to believe with integrity, to be able to persevere in faith in the midst of difficult things, we must use our reason. We must be convinced of the truth of the claims of Christianity. Our daughter Martha is 2, and she's going through an imaginary friend sort of phase at the moment. Now, the thing about this imaginary friend is he's actually a real person, but who she talks to even when he's not there. He's called Dominic. And Dominic has really come to dominate Martha's life. She plays house with Dominic. She wakes her up from her sleep saying, is Dominic awake? Is he going to be next door? Before you put her, the evening comes and we're about to put her down to bed, she says, I want to go to bed because I want to talk to Dominic. Dominic is this ever-present force in her life. And obviously she's enjoying this, and likes having an imaginary friend. I don't know if you ever think to yourself, I wonder, is all my Christianity, is it just like Martha's imaginary friend Dominic? Is it something that I want to have? Is it wishful thinking? But is there actually any basis to believe the accounts of the things that Jesus has done, and therefore to be able to believe these huge claims that Christianity makes about Jesus and makes about our existence? Christians believe that these things that we're talking about are actually true, and that it largely comes down, if you're going to believe them, to the trustworthiness of the Bible, the trustworthiness of the reports of what God has done among his people. And particularly, we think about these 4 accounts of the life and ministry of Jesus, what are called the Gospels in the Bible, and we say to ourselves, can we believe that these things are actually true? And I want you to do a little bit of investigative work this morning, and we're going to use a detective called J. Warner Wallace to help us think about these things, and particularly about the trustworthiness of the Gospels. Wallace was a detective, and he wasn't a Christian, didn't believe in Christianity, but he decided to approach the Gospels, the 4 Gospels in the Bible, and approach them with a detective's mind and say, as witnesses to events, are they credible? And he's going to apply the skills and techniques that he used as an investigator to the Gospels. And what he did particularly was he took events that are recorded in the Gospels that are in at least 2 of a Gospel. And here's what he says in his initial and immediate reaction to going through this. He says, when I first read through the Gospels forensically, comparing those places where 2 or more Gospel writers were describing the same event, I was immediately struck by the inadvertent support that each writer provided for the other. So inadvertent support that each writer provided for the other. He goes on to talk about a principle of evidence gathering that I'd never really heard before described in this way, and I found it fascinating. Here he is again describing it. He says, true, reliable eyewitness accounts are never completely parallel and identical. Instead, they are different pieces of the same puzzle, unintentionally supporting and complementing each other to provide all the details related to what really happened. What he's saying is the exact details in each of the accounts in Jesus' life and ministry are not identical. Some Gospels include some material and other Gospels, other stuff. They all contain the main details, though: where he lived, where he grew up, who his followers were, what he did, claims he made about himself. Strikingly, the manner of his death and the claim of his resurrection are in all four, but there are differences in the accounts. Differences, he says, you would expect to find from different witnesses who are telling the truth. I'm particularly, as I was reading about this, I was particularly interested in what Werner says about witnesses unintentionally supporting each other. And I want to look at that in the case of the feeding of the 5,000, and that's what we're going to focus on this morning. It's clear that the Gospels aren't copies of each other, though in some parts they're obviously relying on the same material. There's no evidence that they are in full synchronization when the accounts were put together. These four Gospels were shaped very differently and had their own emphasis. So deciding whether the accounts are true or not matters, and one of the tools used for investigating reports of different witnesses is something known as undesigned coincidences. This is where a witness gives some detail that adds little to their narrative or the perspective they're bringing. They just report it because they know it to be true. This kind of detail, says Detective Wallace, is one great way of knowing if someone is telling the truth. So let me give you an example. Let's imagine you're investigating a burglary that happened at Grogan's shop in Portrane. You get talking to the woman who lives opposite the shop, and she tells you that there was a tall man with dark hair who did it. She saw him coming out of the shop, running away from the shop. She says she didn't get everything, but she happened to notice that he was wearing a red t-shirt with 3 white letters across the front, some jeans and a pair of runners. Then you get talking to another witness who comes forward, and he tells you he wasn't down at Grogan's, but he was on the 33B, which was on its way from Donabate to Portrane, and he overheard somebody behind him who he never saw talking on the phone, and that person on the phone said to the person in whispers, when he thought he wasn't going to be heard, that he was going to do a number on Grogan's down in Portrane after he'd watched the United match in Keelings. And now suddenly, as a detective, you're thinking to yourself, well, there's one witness telling me that the person who did this had watched the United match, and I have another witness telling me that the man was wearing a red shirt with 3 white letters across the front. Could that be a Man United jersey? Now you're beginning to think these details that seem to the witnesses like they were just side details are putting the story together. They're bringing the truth of the story into full detail, giving colour to the truth of the story. They're undesigned coincidences. You're now beginning to think these witnesses are reliable and telling the truth. We're going to take a break there, and we'll come back in a minute.